If I worked at one of those Gulf facilities named this morning, I would not feel like I was living under a ceasefire. I would feel like I had been handed a countdown without a clock. That is the first thing I want you to understand. Iran named 12 specific oil and gas facilities across the Gulf and told workers to evacuate. Trump extended the ceasefire without a deadline and said Iran's government is seriously fractured. Then he went on television and effectively said, "We caught a ship bringing missile-related materials from China to Iran," and China answered with 4 words that sound harmless until you listen carefully: opposes any malicious association. Most people will treat those as separate headlines. I think they are one machine. And once you see the machine, the day reads very differently. The machine works like this. Iran raises the cost for the Gulf. America lowers immediate pressure on Tehran. China refuses ownership while preserving the ambiguity that keeps the whole arrangement profitable. That is the real story. Not just who threatened what. Not just what cargo was on one vessel. Not just why Trump wants more time. The real story is that this war has developed a permission structure, and China is sitting inside that structure without ever having to claim it openly. I have spent my life looking at incentives, and this is one of the cleanest incentive maps you will ever see. Start with Iran. When Iran names Saudi, Emirati, and Qatari facilities one by one, it is not really trying to educate Washington. Washington already knows Iran can create pain. The target list is aimed at the countries that still want to believe they can stay on the edge of the conflict without becoming the conflict. Iran is telling them that the edge is disappearing. If your territory helps America squeeze us, your economy moves closer to the front line. Your oil terminals, your LNG systems, your workers, your insurance costs, your political calm. That is why a named facility is different from a general threat. A named facility is a forced act of imagination. Once workers are told to leave, management has to think in operating terms: security reviews, insurance questions, contingency staffing, export continuity. Even before a missile is fired, the economics change. That is the genius of the move. Iran does not have to strike immediately to widen the war psychologically. It only has to make the Gulf picture the strike clearly enough that governments start treating the possibility as part of their planning. And now look at America's answer. America did not match the target list with an explicit new red line. It did not publicly say any attack on those sites will trigger immediate consequences of a specific type. It did not set a short, hard deadline forcing Tehran to choose between proposal and pressure. It extended the ceasefire into open territory. On paper, that sounds patient. In practice, patience is never neutral. Patience always advantages somebody. The American argument is easy to understand. Iran is internally divided. Some people inside the system want a way out. A fixed deadline hardens positions. An indefinite pause might loosen them. Maybe Tehran's diplomatic faction can use extra time to produce something the security apparatus will tolerate. Maybe the pause lowers humiliation and raises maneuvering room. That is the nice version. The darker version is that an open-ended ceasefire gives every armed faction inside Iran time to do exactly what armed factions do when they are not being forced into a decision: rebuild, move supplies, finish tunnel work, reposition, argue internally, prepare for the next phase while the other side tells itself the pause is progress. That is why I said the workers do not experience this as a ceasefire. They experience it as uncertainty with a uniform on. Now, put China into the picture and the whole structure snaps into focus. Trump says on television that the United States caught a ship carrying what he called a gift from China. Not rumor, not a leak, not an unnamed official. A sitting American president naming China in public as the source of materials helping Iran's missile capacity during a ceasefire. And what happens next? China does not issue a hard factual rebuttal. China does not say the cargo was misidentified. China does not give you a clean alternative explanation. China says it opposes any malicious association. That is one of those phrases bureaucracies love, because it sounds firmer than it is. In plain English, it means this: we reject your narrative without entering the factual room where your evidence might embarrass us. I want to be very clear here. In statecraft, that choice matters. When a government thinks an accusation is fully false and easy to disprove, it often wants to win on facts. When it thinks the facts are messy, traceable, or strategically compromising, it often attacks interpretation instead. So the four words are not nothing, they are a shield. And Trump's public shrug is the matching half of the shield. He says he is surprised. He says he thought he had an understanding with XI. Then he effectively lets the moment pass. Why? Because the price of pressing the issue now is higher than the price of swallowing it. Now the summit matters. The trade channel matters. The larger US-China relationship matters. Washington does not want the Iran file turning into a direct public rupture with Beijing before it is ready. China understands that perfectly. Tehran understands it too. That is why I call this structure the four-word shield. Iran can keep testing. America can keep postponing the larger China confrontation. And China can remain indispensable. Implicated and publicly unowned all at the same time. Now ask the most important question. Why does this arrangement suit China so well? Because China profits from duration. A longer crisis keeps pressure on energy markets in ways China prepared for years in advance, through reserves, alternative routing, long-term contracting, and sanctioned crude relationships. A longer crisis keeps American military attention and political bandwidth tied down far from the primary theaters Beijing cares about most. A longer crisis increases the value of China's ambiguity. If peace eventually comes, China wants credit as a responsible power. If the war drags on, China wants freedom from blame. The best way to hold both options at once is to say as little as possible while keeping the essential support structures alive. That is not peacemaking. That is strategic non-ownership. It reminds me of certain businesses I have seen over the years. The smartest operator in a fragile deal is often the man who gets economics from both outcomes while keeping legal distance from both outcomes. He wants the upside, not the invoice. The spread, not the signature. That is China here. Look at the oil architecture, and you can see why Iran has not collapsed under pressure the way many people expected. Dark fleet tankers, transponders off, ship-to-ship transfers, yuan settlement, smaller banks, rebranded barrels, data that does not make sense unless you already know the game being played. The point of building that machinery was to create survival capacity under stress. And that machinery is doing exactly what it was built to do. So when America announces a blockade and extends a ceasefire, it is not squeezing a helpless system. It is bargaining against a system that already has a hidden oxygen line. That changes everything. Because a ceasefire only forces concessions if the other side believes the next day hurts more than today. But when China helps keep revenue, trade, and strategic confidence alive, the pause can do the opposite. It can convince hardliners inside Iran that time is not their enemy after all. And then there is the silence on the Gulf facilities themselves, which I find even more telling than the four words about the ship. China has deep interests in Gulf energy continuity. It has every reason to worry about named infrastructure if it truly believes those sites are about to burn. Yet China offered almost nothing visible on that front. Why? Either Beijing thinks Tehran is signaling harder than it intends to act, or Beijing believes it has sufficiently diversified exposure that even serious disruption would not justify open confrontation with Iran. Neither answer is comfortable for the Gulf. Both answers are useful for China. That is the cold brilliance of the position. If China protests too much, it takes on responsibility. If it pressures Iran too visibly, it reduces Iranian dependence as a strategic asset. If it stays mostly quiet, it preserves room with everybody. Iran gets cover, America gets ambiguity, China gets leverage. Now, I want to be fair again to the American case, because there is a rational case here. You can argue that Trump is buying time for the diplomatic faction in Tehran. You can argue that hitting China publicly before a major summit is strategically clumsy. You can argue that target lists in this region are sometimes coercive theater rather than operational intent. All of that is possible, but possibility is not the same thing as structure. The structure right now favors the party that can use time without paying public cost. That party is not America. America has to reassure allies. police shipping lanes, manage energy nerves, protect summit space, and deter escalation, all at once. Iran does not have to do all that. China certainly does not have to do all that. So when people ask me what changed today, my answer is simple. Nothing changed on the surface that was not already visible in outline. What changed is that the outline became explicit. Iran publicly named the Gulf. Trump publicly named China. China publicly chose ambiguity. That is the war's balance sheet in one morning. And if you want to know where this goes, do not listen first to speeches. Watch behavior. Watch whether Gulf operators quietly alter staffing, insurance assumptions, or precaution protocols at the named sites. Watch whether Beijing suddenly appears in the diplomatic record leaning on Tehran after staying publicly spare. Watch whether Washington translates Trump's television language into formal state action before the summit. Sanctions language, Treasury designations, State Department escalation. Anything that turns surprise into policy. If none of that happens, then the story writes itself. The ceasefire is not resolving the conflict. It is stretching it. Iran uses the pause to widen fear. America uses the pause to postpone harder choices. China uses the pause to sit behind 4 words, while the structure it benefits from remains intact. That is why I would not feel protected if I worked at one of those facilities tonight. I would feel like I had been told the war is paused, while every important incentive in the region says otherwise. And if China is the quiet reason Iran can keep taking one more step without losing its footing, then the real issue is no longer whether Beijing is involved. The real issue is whether 4 words are all it takes to stay involved without ever having to own the consequences.